Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. For the last couple of years, alarms have gone off regarding the world facing a refugee crisis. Nation states increasingly see migrants as a threat, fearing the influx of people. In response to this, many states take measures like the US president has by wanting to put up a border wall, and how the Australian government has reopened a detention center on Christmas Island. In the midst of all this politics, those who seek asylum become lost in the conversation. What are their rights, and how must the international community respond to the global refugee crisis? To discuss this, we welcome our guest to the show today. Joining us is Mayek, lawyer and a human rights advocate, joining us from Melbourne. Also joining us today is Adrian Pereira, who is an executive director of North-South Initiative, a human rights organization based in Malaysia. Thank you both for joining us. Adrian, I'd like to begin with you. When we're talking about asylum seekers and, of course, the global refugee crisis, what are some of the standards nations who are providing refuge should aspire towards in terms of basic human rights? What conventions are out there to monitor this?
So thanks for having me. I think when we talk about both migration and refugees, the global community, we have the UN declarations and conventions on refugees. And there's also the recent Global Compact on Refugees, which was signed middle of last year.
Yeah.
And of course, it goes through very complex, attempts to address very complex issues from border security, shared responsibility, and of course, when governments try to solve problems, they look at financing. So, of course, from the basic human rights, you need to ensure that refugees have access, safety, they have their right to food, right to health, and many others. The list is very long.
Yeah, and Adrian, you mentioned here the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly Migration that countries in December signed, but many countries resisted signing to this, and it, of course, is regulations that are recommendations and not something that must be followed by each and every country. So what exactly do we see on the global front as cooperation in actually addressing this crisis as opposed to just having words on a paper?
So government's primary concern is, of course, security, and that also translates into job securities for their nationals, their own nationals, and addressing this it's a good time for the global community to rethink what global borders actually means, what does the passport actually mean for people who are on the move. And when I look at it, of course, both the refugees and the migrants who are looking for jobs, moving all over this. And I think this is really a global challenge. And to be honest, in my 3 or 4 years of trying to analyze, I still don't see any solutions nearby.
Yeah, and when we're talking of a lack of solutions, something that I'll next question to make here, that when we're talking about how governments are responding to the influx of migrants, we are seeing Australia opening up the Christmas Island, which has been very controversial in the past. Tell us about this move.
Well, look, the situation here in Australia is that there were two centers, being a detention center in Nauru, which is a bordering country across here in Australia, and there's also the Manus Island, where the asylum seekers were indefinitely detained and kept there until there were solutions, political solutions. Mainly, this is what it comes to. So. Since 2012, there have been over 1,300 asylum seekers detained on Nauru and on Manus Island. So thousands. Over that period of time, some people have been relocated since then to the United States. People that have been assessed to be refugees, and even then, the people that have been left on Nauru and Manus Island have also been assessed as genuine refugees, but yet remain to be detained on those islands. Recently, there's an independent senator by name Karen Phelps, who came to the parliament through that was lost by the prime minister. When Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull lost the leadership, he resigned from parliament. So Karen Phelps was elected in that constituency. When she came into the parliament, she came on a strong premise that she was going to change the policies she was going to do something about the refugees that were indefinitely detained on Manus and on Nauru.
So
that has been.
Mike, while we're talking about House has opened up, of course, before it was closed down last year, the United Nations widely condemned the conditions over there, the trauma and mental distress that individuals who were detained in those islands faced. Tell us more about that, the human condition of those refugees, migrants being detained in those islands.
The conditions have been extremely tragic, particularly on Nauru and Manus. There have been people that have committed suicide on those islands. There have been reports, credible reports. Medical doctors have also reported people having been stressed out, suffering from mental-related illnesses. So it was determined, and there has been a big political pressure here in Australia, which led then to the children being, eventually all the children being evacuated from those two islands. But there remained over about 430 people on Nauru. There are about over 500 on Manus. So when Karen Phelps, the independent member of parliament, came into parliament, she moved to became what is called a Medevac bill, which has been legislated into law. So what happened was the government was not very pleased with the Medevac legislation, which means people that were assessed to need medical assistance were to be evacuated to the mainland for medical treatment. Now the government was not pleased with that. So what the government did was to reopen Christmas Island as some sort of retribution. So that's what it seems to every Australian and every commentator every observer on the issues of refugees here in Australia.
Mike, I do want to talk more about the alarmism that is created about the influx of migrants that is to come, that many people are saying might be false, might be exaggerated. But for that, I'd like to ask Adrian about the conditions there in Malaysia related to the refugees. There are many Rohingya refugees being housed. There are many Syrian refugees that are there. Tell us about the conditions that they are facing.
Yeah, so Malaysia, unfortunately, is not one of the countries which signed the Refugee Convention. So there's no real moral or political obligation to ensure that services are provided to them, and this is really unfortunate. Malaysia is one of the high GDP developing countries, and we have more than enough to share with the around maybe 160,000 refugees and asylum seekers. So conditions are really appalling, and they don't really have the right to work. So one thing that governments fail to address are, of course, root causes in why refugees come, and without looking at the root causes, it kind of creates a lack of empathy or even an understanding of why we should take care of them. So it's more seen as a security issue, a cross-border issue. But the hypocrisy in all of this is governments are still relying economically and sucking a bit of economic gain from refugees. And it's just a matter of giving them their proper documentation and recognition as humans with dignity, which I think can really solve a lot of problems. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us, talking to us about this. We are now joined by Azra Banu, who's the chairperson of Care Refugees in Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us, Azra. On the same note, while we're talking about the refugee conditions in Malaysia, our previous guest mentioned how that Malaysia has not signed the UN Refugee Convention, and for that reason, there is no political obligation to treat these refugees in a fair manner. But what is happening amongst the public? Because, of course, it cannot just be political. There must be some mobilization amongst the masses in order in trying to persuade the government to give these individuals their rights. What can you tell us about that?
All right. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. In answer to your question, there is actually a conference being organized by a few stakeholders, including UNHCR and a few civil society organizations, that's coming up third week of March, in which we are engaging the various ministries, relevant ministries from the Malaysian government. And we're calling for basically calling for four objectives: legal access to documentation, to education, healthcare, and employment. One of the biggest problems faced by refugees in Malaysia is the lack of legal standing, which then does not allow them to, first of all, hold legal employment. And that obviously leads to a host of other problems. We have already engaged the relevant ministries before this in December last year, and we've brainstormed with them a few ideas, which we hope will crystallize at a conference in March.
And Azra, here when we're talking about the legal status, of course, many of the refugees there, especially the Rohingya Muslims, have are stateless, which creates even another hindrance in terms of integrating them into the system. Can you tell us about that? What are the specific hindrances faced by those refugees who are stateless?
It's not just the Myanmar Rohingyas. Many aren't aware that we've also got Myanmar Chins and Myanmar Mons, who are not Muslims, they're Christians. And they have been here probably into second generation now. There are two generations here. And it's quite telling that when we first began our NGO maybe 8 years ago, the mood from the public generally was empathetic. But over the past 4 or 5 years, it has turned rather hostile, and the refugees are seen as a burden, as a social problem.
Yeah.
And assimilation is naturally going to be close to impossible.
Yeah.
First of all, they look different, they speak different, they eat different,
Yeah.
and then they have a different culture.
And Azra, here you mentioned how there is a perception that these refugees are a burden. What can you tell us? How does the global conversation regarding refugees need to change in order for a more humane angle, a more humane perspective to emerge?
We need to portray them as people and not as refugees. We keep referring to them as refugees. That in itself, I think, needs to change. Here, for example, what we try to do is we try to hold public discourses where we show people that all these so-called refugees, they had lives just like you and me. They had regular lives. But they had to leave all that behind due to desperation and had to flee to the country that they could get to the easiest. And here in Malaysia, we have refugees from Myanmar because it's easy for them to get into. So I think we need to start portraying them as people, as humans, just rather than just branding them by this term known as refugees today.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Azra Banu, for joining us. We're now joined by Anthony Lowenstein, who is an investigative journalist and an author and who has covered the refugee crisis extensively. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us. When we're talking about the refugee crisis here, and we're talking about how the burden relies on certain economies, certain countries more than others, 84% of the refugee burden does lie with poorer countries. And yet we're seeing no global consensus on how to deal with this. We saw the Morocco conference in December, which did not have any outcomes. What needs to be done to create a systematic way of approaching the global refugee crisis here?
I think one of the things that is regularly ignored in much of the Western media, and I should say that I am an Australian living in East Jerusalem, is how little responsibility the West takes in creating refugees in the first place. Let's think of the last 15, 18 years since 9/11 in the US. Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, the list goes on. These are all wars caused by US and foreign and Western military intervention that have caused millions and millions of refugees to flee. Now, not every single refugee in the world comes from those countries. Africa, for example, is full of a lot of issues which causes many people to flee within Africa and within their own countries. But I think often in the West, we choose to willfully ignore the reality of why so many countries actually are creating these problems in the first place. And that, to me, is a real issue that we should look at more closely.
Yeah. And what are we seeing on that front of a cooperation in terms of we're seeing the rise of the right wing and there is being a resistance toward even a progressive dialogue regarding this issue, and just closing off your borders does not mean that the problem is solved. So what is the step forward? What needs to be done to rectify the global conversation?
Well, in some ways, I think, as your last speaker said, it's about humanising refugees in the first place. I'm Australian, even though I'm not living there at the moment. And in the last 20 years, I've done a lot of research on both on the ground in Australia and other countries near Australia, in how Australia has attempted, sadly with a great degree of success. Let me explain what I mean by success. Success in terms of creating an incredibly brutal method of detaining refugees for years in awful offshore detention centres. Now, what does that mean practically? It means that many people who are fleeing, who have legitimate claims to asylum, the United Nations finds them legitimate refugees, are kept on places like Nauru in the Pacific, Manus Island on Papua New Guinea and other centres. So until we actually humanise refugees and say that they are fleeing for good reason, there are up to 75 million refugees currently in the world right now. Climate change will only cause that problem to get worse. So I think the challenge very much for those on the political left and those who are challenging those on the right, who sadly at the moment in parts of Europe and the US and in my country, Australia, and indeed here in Israel as well, have demonised refugees so successfully that we need to challenge that narrative every single day.
Yeah, and that is a very important point there. And with that, I want to take my next question to Mike here. So when we talked about how there will be an influx of these migrants that will be detained on Christmas Island, it seems that though there is a conversation and debate whether or not these claims are exaggerated, whether there is in fact a threat of migrants coming in. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we've got to understand the biggest problem here in Australia is how the issue of refugees is being viewed in terms of hard stance on refugees, even people that have been identified to be genuine refugees. The criteria for identifying refugees are quite simple. All the countries that are signatory to the refugee conventions or any other national laws regulating the flow of migration and refugees have these specific criteria on how to assess a refugee, a person that is in fear of persecution from their home country. If that person is identified to be in fear of in their home country, then that person is a refugee. There's no doubt that person should be given the opportunity to resettle in the third country. So that's a huge issue here. People, the countries and political parties are adopting some hard stance on refugees, even on their obligations, which they are signatory to. And this is what we've seen here in Australia, where we've got the Conservative Liberal Party, coalition party, adopting strong borders, campaigning on strong borders, that even people that have been assessed to be genuine refugees cannot be resettled here in Australia in order to deter others from even contemplating to move to Australia. That's the problem. We've also seen a party such as the Labour Party, which has been somehow sympathetic and empathetic towards the plight of refugees in the past, as is also adopting this similar views to the
we do have the Australian perspective here, but last question to Anthony here. When we talked about how the threats over here might be exaggerated, I want to ask in terms of a more global perspective as well. We've seen Trump continuously using this as an excuse to create a sense of fear of migrants. Is there, in fact, an exaggerated claim of the threat posed by migrants?
Well, I would say no, but I think the definition of what an immigrant or migrant is, in fact, has profoundly changed since the definition was created in the wake of the Second World War. For example, being an economic migrant is not technically speaking a reason to claim asylum, and yet there are places in many places around the world that actually people have literally no option but to flee because they can't get a job, they can't work, they can't support their family. If you look at climate change refugees, climate change wasn't talked about 50, 60 years ago, but yet as we're moving forward, climate change will in fact be a key reason why many people will be fleeing from parts of Africa and Asia and elsewhere. So if you're saying, are any refugees exaggerating their claims? Yes, I'm sure they are, of course they are. But the vast majority of people who are fleeing from, say, Syria or Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, are fleeing legitimate persecution, and therefore they need to be given safe haven. And sadly, Trump is creating fear in the American population, which historically shows can be very, very effective unless there's a strong alternative pushing back against it.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us and talking to us. We have to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. Oh, you're watching Indus Special. Welcome back to Indus Special. According to the United Nations estimate, every year some 600 million people fall sick due to unsafe food. Out of this staggering number, approximately 420,000 people, die due to this damaging unsafe food impact. Now, food should be a source of nourishment, but if it becomes the precise reason as to why over 200 diseases, including certain types of cancers, are caused, then there is an urgent need to reevaluate our food systems. We discuss on tonight's show the wide-ranging impact of unsafe food and how international cooperation is needed to resolve it. To discuss this, we are joined by Mr. Farrukh Toirov, who's deputy representative of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And we are also joined by Dr. Nomeena Anis, who's the nutritionist from Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Nomeena, I'd like to begin with you. Now, we talked about unsafe food, but can you tell us exactly what unsafe food is? Is it contaminated food? Is it food that is expired? What exactly comes under that category?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to the show. And unsafe food is one which is contaminated, and it is not fit for eating, and it can pose certain problems related to health if it is taken. So it should be avoided at all costs.
Okay, so Dr. Nomeena, we talked about what unsafe food is, but how exactly does it get contaminated? What happens during the production process or afterwards?
The food can get contaminated at various stages, and we need to look from the farm to the fork level. That means from the production side to the consumer aspects, and when the food is ingested, we need to take care of all the different areas within the food chain. So it can contaminated maybe during the pre-harvest stage. It can contaminated during the post-harvest stage, during the storage process, the transportation process, and within the markets, or adding some kind of chemicals to it within the markets, or at the consumer stage, where you can keep the food for a longer period of time and it gets contaminated, or you don't properly cook it. And so there are various levels where the food can be contaminated.
Yes, okay. And Mr. Farrukh, when we're talking about contamination of food, of course, this is a global issue. And to draw attention to this issue, a conference was held in Ethiopia earlier. And it was talked about how it has become everyone's problem because the world is so globalized now. What can you tell us about this? How has the food system become more interlinked with different countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, we all know that with the globalization of the economies, our countries are more and more interlinked between each other than ever before. The food chains, the food systems these days are originating in one country, but the end consumer of the agricultural products produced can be completely in a different country. That involves harvesting, processing, packing, labeling, transportation, trade, and consumption of the food commodities produced in one country by the end beneficiaries who are residing completely in a different part of the globe. That's why, having in mind this interconnectedness of the economies of all the countries, our organization, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, we are calling for closer cooperation between all the countries to come together to think about developing common standards of controlling the quality of the food which is produced in one country, whether it is for domestic market or for the export. So that is a reason why the importance of controlling the food quality and standards is becoming a more and more important issue in the global arena.
Yes. And what can you tell us about the outcome of this conference that took place in Ethiopia? What was agreed upon between all the member states that attended the conference?
The agreement of the all member states was along bringing closer cooperation in coming up with unified standards, because unfortunately until now the set of the standards of the food quality still is not fully compliant between the different countries. In the more developed countries, the standards of the food quality control are more strict. In the less developed or developing countries, the level of control and the level of the standards is slightly at the lower standards. So such incompatibility is causing disruptions and difficulties in trade between the developing countries and the more developed country markets. Therefore, the outcomes of the conference were calling for closer collaboration between the member states, sharing information, sharing knowledge and technologies, so that the countries in the developing world could also benefit from the advantages developed by the modern economies, and bring in those knowledge and technologies to the food production and processing sector in the developing world. There was a big achievement by itself, so that countries agreed to come and work closer together. Because at the end of the day, we all understand that the well-being of one nation and the quality of food produced in one country will ultimately have an impact on the other countries in the region.
Yes, and I do want to explore what happened in that conference and what the outcome was. But before that, I want to ask Dr. Nomeena, what are you seeing in terms of health trends that you find alarming when it comes to contaminated food in recent decades? What can you say are the types of diseases that are rising due to contaminated foods?
Yeah. Food safety is becoming a major issue, and the food may be contaminated with various bacteria, viruses, parasites, as well as there are chemical contaminants, and there are physical substances that can get into the foods and they can contaminate the food. So the food-borne illnesses are on the rise, and they are the major causes of the diarrheas and pneumonias, as well as contribute to various kind of infections, as well as leading towards cancers and certain other diseases. So food safety is a major concern, and it needs to be tackled. And for example, within the children suffering from diarrhea is like many of it is related to the contaminated food and the foodborne illnesses. And it is said that about 1 in 10 people who get illnesses, they are related to the foodborne illnesses.
And Dr. Nomeena, you did stress on that point that food safety is a major issue. But of course, with that comes food security as well. And Mr. Farrukh, that's something I want to ask you. The Food and Agricultural Organization's chief stated that there is no food security without food safety. But when we see so many parts of the world that are going hungry due to conflict, due to starvation, how can we equate both of them? And is it even practical to equate food security with food safety?
Well, that's absolutely the linkage which was shown by the studies undertaken by our organization in collaboration with other United Nations agencies, that there is a direct correlation between the food safety and the nutritious intake of the people and the status of malnutrition in the world. The problem of malnutrition is not related only on availability of the food. The problem of food security and malnutrition are related on combination of the several factors. And the availability of the food and quantities of the food is only one of the factors, like how much food is produced in the country and how much food is available in the market. But then the capacity of the people to purchase this food is another factor. Like the poor segments of the population have limited access to the good quality food because they cannot afford it. So their access to the food is an issue. Then the consumption and absorption and the composition of the food items is another issue, which is an important aspect leading to food insecurity of the large number of the population. And while some items of the food, like grains or rice or wheat or other types of the sort of low-cost food items being accessible to the population, the higher-end products or higher-cost products, including vegetables, is quite often not accessible, which makes the increase of the risk of being food insecure. Therefore, the issue of food safety is adding up to this equation another layer of complication. The problem is that because of the health issues caused by the unsafe food, the population, especially at the younger age, get easily sick from the contamination of the food, and dealing with consequences of these diseases, it increases the probability of this person becoming food insecure.
Yeah.
Therefore, the contribution of the unsafe food to food insecurity.
And Mr. Farrukh, I do want to talk more about how there is a cost that is incurred when there is unsafe food, the health costs that are incurred, the economic costs that are incurred. But you mentioned here how little children get impacted. And I want to ask another guest who has joined us just now, Dr. Ayesha Khan, who's a nutritionist. How are health trends and how are diseases impacting children who are under 5, especially nowadays because of contaminated foods?
Actually, thank you for having me telephonically on the show. So already you were talking about the safety of the food and the food security. So most of us, we are all aware of the fact that every year almost 600 million people, they fall sick because of the malnutrition and because of the, the different illnesses and the diseases that they fall prey because of the contaminated food. And not only this, 400,000 plus people, they die because of the contaminated food.
Yeah.
So this is the dilemma for the developing country. On the one side, they are striving for the development. On the other side, as basic as of the basic right of the health and the nutrition and plus the food availability, they are striving for this as well. So you said that how this has an impact on the growth of the children, because since this is the most vulnerable group,
yeah,
which is affected by the contamination.
And
so
what are the specific problems and diseases that you're witnessing are on the rise when it comes to younger children?
Unfortunately, in a developing country like Pakistan, as simple as the disease which is diarrhea is so prevalent. among the children because of the contaminated food. And it becomes like not only a huge task for the children to to combat these problems, but also at the same time they are in their growing stage as well. As we all know that infection and malnutrition, they have a synergistic response.
Yeah.
So if a child who is already predisposed to malnutrition and is getting again and again is falling sick because of the contaminated food, this not only affects his or her growth pattern, but also makes them so very vulnerable for the other diseases as well.
Yeah.
So as simple as the different types of the diarrhea, but the enteric problems are the problems which are related to the intestine and the digestive system of the alimentary canal of the child.
And Dr. Ayesha, you mentioned here the challenges that countries in this South Asian region face. But with that, I do want to ask Dr. Nomeena, when we're talking about food contamination, unsafe food being a global issue, what are some of the issues and diseases that are on the rise in developed nations as well?
Because you see, it's now becoming a global food system, and the food that may be produced in one country, it is transported to the other countries. And many of these, either the developed nations or developing nations, may not be the food producing countries. So they are getting the food from other countries. So across the food chain, if those food standards and regulations, they are not met properly, and food quality is not properly checked, a contaminated food from one country can pass to the other country.
Yeah.
And it can contain various, it can contain parasites, bacteria, it may be contaminated with heavy metals and other things that can transport the disease as well with the food into the food chain of the other country. So it's like across the globe, and we need to ensure quality and food standards so that such food does not get into the other areas.
And with that point, Mr. Farrukh, when we're talking about there being a maintenance of certain standards, and we're talking about how there's a greater link between developed countries and developing countries, the issue of exploitative practices during gathering of raw materials for the production of processed food still exists. If you're paying the farmer less than what you're earning in terms of profits, it is more likely that the farmer would use more unsafe practices. So what needs to be done in the production process? What changes need to be brought upon in that part in order to target and tackle this issue of unsafe food?
Absolutely. You really rightly pointed in one of the key issues which exists in many of the developing world, the developing countries, where the unfair share of the cost of the food is reaching the farmers, who are the initiators, the origin of the production of the food. So if you look at the entire value chain of the food from production until consumption, all the other players of the chain are making much more economic benefits compared to what the producer, the initiator, the farmer is receiving. Such system exists because of the variety of factors, and then in that sense our organization is working closely with the farmers to enhance their knowledge and skills in producing quality food, and also adding value to the production that they have, so that they would be benefiting from the higher end elements of the chain of the food, not only relying and basing themselves on the production alone. For instance, bringing farmers together to create a cooperative or groups of farmers who can jointly do their own initial processing of the food together, incorporating modern and advanced technologies with the assistance of the government and us, the international community, has a good and positive impact.
And Mr. Farrukh, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but what can the benefits, widespread benefits of this be? Because the system you're talking about could be applicable to a few examples, but isn't there a need for a structural change for communities to be able to produce from the food chain of jumping from producing raw materials to processed foods? What needs to be done in terms of organizations that are monitored by the governments that ensure that exploitative practices do not take place within the country's bounds?
It goes back to the basic standards of applying proper rules and regulations and control mechanisms. Like, for example, the quality control of the food standards, which should be in the countries aligned with international standards, is one of the way forward. From the side of us, the United Nations, we are custodians of the Codex Alimentarius, which defines the standards of the food commodities all over the world among the member countries. So application of such standards in the country will help the government to enforce the quality standards which are compliant with the international standards. So once you have successfully applied such standards in the domestic market, the producers of the agricultural and food products in domestic markets will be better positioned to increase exports. And that is also such a program is very likely needed in the developing countries where our organization works, including here in Pakistan. Having application of the international food quality standards would largely benefit and will ensure increase of the export potential of the country for food commodities and increase the revenues that the agriculture sector can provide in the country.
Yes. Okay, those standards are, of course, the need of the hour, but before they are imposed, that will take a long time. Dr. Ayesha Khan, what can you tell individuals sitting at home from the perspective of a nutritionist, what they need to be aware of when they're going out shopping for food and making sure that it is not contaminated?
Okay, when we talk about like contamination, we have to keep in mind the type of the food. Like, there are two types of the food, like perishable items or the non-perishable items. As far as like the perishable items are concerned, they are more predisposed to the, to getting rotten and getting decomposed. So one has to keep an eye open for the perishable items like that of the two sorts of vegetables, that either they are not rotten or decomposed, and they are not like vulnerable for the bacterial attacks. So this way, we are trying to eliminate the one aspect of contamination, which is like bacteria and the other contaminants, which are cross-contaminated through such items. Other things are like the perishable items, such as like the flour and the different kinds of the dry ration. One has to make sure that the quality, sometimes they are like very well packed, very well packaged and all, but at least they do not have like the small insects like beetles, and apparently they are like fine to look at. B, they most of the things, when we talk about like food security, the actual say the components of the food, they have not been extracted out of the food items. So, for example, if you're talking about the flour, whatever is written on the package, whatever is written on it, at least the composition should be likewise. And the third and the most important thing, like when we talk about food and water, the surroundings and the places where these things are actually, the places which are furnishing these things should at least be clean and hygienic.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ayesha Khan, for joining us. And last question to you, Mr. Farrukh. You mentioned earlier too about the economic costs incurred by countries which have to deal with unsafe food. The Food and Agricultural Organization estimated that $95 billion per year are incurred as costs. Can you tell us more about this?
In fact, yes, the economic cost of not having proper check and balances and control mechanisms for ensuring food quality and food standards is quite huge in the whole world, especially in the developing countries where the impact of such losses are quite significant. The economic costs of diseases and consequences which the contaminated food is causing is quite enormous to the economy, and also to the households and the vulnerable and poor populations who has to deal with such consequences is quite high. Therefore, comparably smaller investment in ensuring the good quality and control of the food quality in the markets has an immense impact on the well-being of the population and will prevent the massive possibility of massive expenses in the health issues, but also in reducing the number of malnourished population, which has a very long-term impact on the generations to come. So that's how we see the importance of addressing the food safety and application of the food safety standards in the markets, in the domestic markets, starting from the production until processing and consumption.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Farrukh, for joining us, Nomeena for joining us and taking out time to talk to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye and take care.